In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this remix. I made this remix for the Soundgarden, which is one of the biggest progressive house, organic house labels. This is Nick Warren and Hernan Catano playing it at Lovelands Festival last weekend in Amsterdam. And for a little bit of inspiration, I was at the festival as an attendee. It was really cool to see the biggest progressive house DJs in the world playing my remix while I was part of the crowd and they didn't even know I was there. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I took the original sounds, or the remix stems as they're called, and created my own version for this remix on the Soundgarden. Shout out to Zanky Gulati for the original mix. He's an awesome artist. If you haven't checked him out already, I definitely suggest you do. The best way to support me so I can keep making videos like this is to either download this track off Beatport or support me on Patreon, where you get access to project files, preset packs, sample packs, access to feedback, live streams, and more. Both of those links are in the description below. Let's make some music. Okay, so the first thing that I do when remixing for a label is I listen to the label's music, making sure that what I'm going to be writing matches what that label is releasing. And since the Soundgarden is a mix of like progressive house and organic house, they have a pretty strong characteristic sound of a little bit of uplifting and daytime music mixed with progressive house. That's the style that I went for in this remix. The first thing I'll do when I get a remix is I go through the remix pack, and this is usually consisting of stems of the original track, so bounced out audio versions of the different layers. Sometimes you get MIDI, and usually you get the pre-mastered version of the track as well for reference. These are the stems that Zanky provided for me, so I'd like to go through, listen to each of the individual stems, and choose which ones I'm going to use that I think will be working well in my remix. This is the lead sound, and I definitely want to make it very obvious that I'm doing a remix, so it's good to include some of the strong original song content in the remix. So lead sounds, vocals, hooks, things that are very obvious from the original, you can include in your remix so it pays homage to the original, and then people can identify that as an original track that you have remixed. So lead, definitely going to be using that, so I would just maybe move that over here, going through the different sounds. I'll use this, but maybe something like the bass I want to write myself. So I would just get rid of that, move it over there. Once I go through all the stems, I delete what I don't use, and then I start writing my remix. This track is 120 beats per minute, and it is in D minor or F major, which is the relative major to D minor, something that I'll talk about a little bit later in the video. And I'll start with my kick and bass. So the kick, 3 layers, low, mid, high. And I've compressed them all together and added a little bit of overdrive to add a bit more crunchiness to the top end of the kick. It just helps it cut through the mix a little bit better. It's not super strong, but something that I've been doing in a lot of my kick drums just to help really get through the mix without worrying about turning it up more in volume. Next, I have the bass, and with the bass, some simple processing, EQ, mid-side EQ, and multi-band compression, and then a sidechain compressor from the actual kick drum, cutting out only the lower frequencies when the kick is playing. And I have 4 different layers, which is on the lower side of layers for me. I like to have a lot of layers in my bass, but what I'm thinking about when I'm writing this track is that I want this to represent myself as well as the Soundgarden. So I'm wanting to write a bass line that is both progressive and organic. So to do that, I've combined patterns that I find are very common in both those genres. So if we look at the bass here in the sub, let's take a listen to the kick and sub bass together. So I've combined a rolling style of bass line mixed with an organic kind of slowed down, sustained type bass line. With organic house, the longer notes with gaps in between actually can slow down the perceived tempo of the track so it doesn't feel so aggressive and fast paced. And the rolling feeling of the progressive house, by having more consecutive notes not broken up, gives me that more energetic feeling of the progressive house. So that's why I've combined the two, and then I've added this bass rising, this kind of like scooping effect, because it gives it a little bit of an uplifting feel, and with Soundgarden, that's the feeling that I want to get. So to do that little glide, I actually just had to go into my serum patch here, and I had to turn on the mono and the portamento here. So if I turn this off, when I play 2 notes, it'll play both notes, but if I turn it on, it'll actually glide to that, and the timing is based on this portamento. Just by adding a little bit, it can glide up from that lower D to the higher C, and it sounds really cool. Just adds a little bit of fun to the bass line. The patch itself is super simple. It's just a sawtooth wave with filtering. And then this monster wavetable, which sounds really crazy. I'm just filtering out most of the sound and adding a little bit of pluck to that so it's a bit punchier. But really, this is just to give it some warmth in the low end. And then I have some other layers of bass as well. So I have this tom and then 2 bass stabs. This is the tom. And the idea behind this tom is that it's just giving a little bit of extra groove. Every time I add another one of these bass layers, I want to add something to the groove. I want it to be encouraging the groove, making it more interesting without overtaking the whole entire track. Like I said, I like how the bass line is not super aggressive. If I wanted to speed up the perceived tempo, I could actually add in some extra notes here. So if I go to 16ths, I can add in some notes in when these empty gaps are. The gaps actually create a sense of pulling the track back and slowing down the energy, and the more notes I put, the faster the energy will feel. Check this out. Listen how it sounds now with more notes. Compared to before. This is so valuable because it really dictates the energy of the bass line, which can dictate the energy of the rest of the track. And since I don't want a super energetic bass line, I've taken out these little spots that have given me that gap that slows down the track and makes it feel more appropriate for the Soundgarden. Moving on to some of these extra layers here, I have this secondary groove. Just something to fill up a bit of the space, make it a bit more interesting. Whenever you're adding layers like this, you want it to be more interesting. You want it to be adding value to the groove, making it groovier without taking away from the mix. Then I have a second and third bass layer. These are also what I call identifiers in your track, and I like putting these in so that they stand out in a mix, or when people hear them, they have things that are easy to catch their attention, to keep them engaged. Making sounds that are catchy and easy to hear throughout the mix makes it easier for people to remember that track and to latch onto it and get kind of stuck in the groove. When I heard Nick and Hernan playing this track at Loveland Festival last weekend, these are the first things that I noticed. I was just dancing, I was jamming, I was grooving, whatever, and all of a sudden I hear this. Bum, 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 bum. Those bass notes. I heard that and I was like, are they playing my track? Because even though it was only 30 seconds into the track, I could identify it because of these sounds specifically. And this doesn't just have to be bass, this can be other instruments as well. I actually do have one of the drums that I'll mention after. Both these basses are just presets that I cycle through from different preset packs. I'll put a link to some bass preset serum patches in the link in the description below. It's a great way of breeding creativity because if you're just cycling through some different presets, you can hear some sounds that maybe you wouldn't think to make, or just hear sounds that fit better in your mix. Of course, making your own sounds is great, but reaching for presets sometimes just really helps with creativity. Let's listen to the kick and bass one more time. For the drums, I also wanted to combine progressive house and organic house. So the drums aren't super punchy, but they are full of shakers and percussion that makes it very progressive house, but they're a little bit softer hitting and sound a little bit more organic. So let's take a listen to the drums first. Going into the first hi-hat, 2 layers. They're actually the same layer. The second one, I've just cut out the beginning of the transient and then faded it in to make this really soft hit. Then this surrounds the hi-hat, which it sounds really nice. It's like this groovy, kind of swingy, almost like a jazzy kind of rhythm. And this is because it surrounds the hi-hat, it fills up the empty space around the hi-hat, and it makes it feel more rolling and more floaty. And without it, it feels like the track is a little bit choppier and a little bit techier. So by adding just that little bit of soft hit, it fills up that empty space. With the drums, a lot of the time, I'm adding a bit of vocoder to make it a bit more white noise sounding. And then I'm cutting out some of the high end because I find that high end actually makes things feel more aggressive. So sharpness equals aggressiveness. So I'm dampening the high end just a little bit so it feels a little bit softer in the mix. My second hat, Pretty simple, but I'm adding some width to this. Usually I like to have one hat that is in the center of the mix and then one that is panned and wider, and that gives me best of both worlds. Then I have this shaker loop. These are where the track really elevates the drums. Shaker loops like this add a ton of value, and they're really easy to find if you have some good sample packs. I'll put another link to sample packs for shakers in the description. And basically, this just adds a lot of value by giving you a ton of swing and airiness without having to do too much. So here's the first loop. So not overly complicated, but I wouldn't really think to add these types of sounds into my loop. But when I try it in my track, it works well. So we listen with the hats. Add in this extra one. And now my drum loop sounds so good already just by adding these 2 shaker loops on top. Again, super simple, but just layering up multiple gives so much dynamics. And then I have another shaker loop here. This one I made myself. Nice and swingy. We have some vocoder for some white noise. We have some width with the has effect, and then the side chain from the kick to give it that nice groove. I like to have one that's a bit more to the grid, a little bit more solid like this one when I'm adding multiple layers of these kind of deep, organic swingy shakers, because the swingy shakers sometimes can get a feeling of being too loose and off the grid, and it kind of slows down the track too much. So I'm using this shaker here to make the tempo just a little bit more inside the shakers. Little details like this sometimes make a big difference. Just adds a little bit of power to the drums there. And then I have 2 more percussion. This is another identifier. This is what I was talking about with the bass. This by itself, not that interesting. But in the whole drum loop, listen how much you can really latch on and get into that groove. It's a really simple idea, but it really helps you stay locked into the groove, and that's why I placed it there. Super effective for helping people listen for a long time without getting bored. Last but not least, we have one more tambourine shaker. Might be going overkill with the amount of shakers that I'm putting here, but this one's really quiet. And then finally, I have this synth that actually came from the remix pack. It's nice because it's tonal, it has a pitch, so even from the beginning of the track, you can hear it, and it starts to set the mood of the track. It's very quiet, but I just like how it kind of glues the whole track together. And what I've done here, you'll see I do in a lot of the remix stems, is I change the pitch. So one thing that I like to do with my remixes is I like to take the tracks and manipulate them by changing the remix stems. So this one, I've just pitched up by 1 perfect fifth, 7 semitones. This is how it sounds before. But I liked it up in the higher note. What this does is allows you to use the remix stems and manipulate them, so you're still using the remix parts, but you're changing them to fit into your track, and you're paying homage to the original while still making it your own. And I do this a lot, and I love doing it. It's so much fun for me to try out these different samples in different pitches and using the different algorithms, which I'll show you in the next part here. So now moving on to the synths. But like I did with that last part of the drums, I'd like to take audio from the original or things that I record and I resample them. So I recorded this serum sound that I made and I changed the pitch of that. So the original is actually this, but I liked it lower. It fits the track a little bit better. And then if you change here the algorithm, so this one is on beats. If I change that to complex, it sounds different. And if I change it to complex pro, it's different. So it's cool how you can just pitch things up or down and then try the different algorithms and see how it plays out within Ableton, and you can get some really interesting sounds this way. I do this a lot of the time. And I'm just adding this to kind of break up the monotony of the track. So if we listen, we can pay attention to when this comes in. Very subtle. But the idea with these synths is that there's a lot of movement going on. There's a lot of details and subtleties, and there's always some filtering and panning and movement happening in the background. That's what keeps this song so lush and this style so lush. Actually, in Zanke's tracks, I noticed that he puts a ton of pads and strings, and that actually inspired me to put even more than I usually do when writing music. Usually I'll have a drone pad, 2 or 3 strings and atmospheres, but when I got Zanke's stems, there was so many good pad sounds that I decided to use a lot of them in this track, and it really helps to make this feel super lush. So I'll show you an example of this. What we can do is actually go down to some of these strings. So these are my strings that I made. Some stabs over here. Right? Always just, that's the only part that does that in this big MIDI clip, right? Just adding little variations here and there can really elevate everything in your track. And what I can do here is I could even record some automation, some auto filtering, some EQ automation, some auto panning, things that I can add in to the sound to make it even more unique. To make this very lush style of music, it usually takes a lot of strings and pads and lead sounds that are very full sounding, a lot of higher frequencies that are a lot of reverb and movement. You can use things like filters and automation of volumes and different panning to create a very lush environment of atmospheres. So you can have, when one atmosphere is kind of coming up, you can start to turn down the other one in volume so that they're kind of replacing each other and playing all over the track. This is easier said than done, but it is really, really effective in making a very full, lush atmospheric track to have in multiple layers with a lot of movement. So I'll show you an example of this first. We have this ambient pad here. This is from the original, but I've adjusted it a little bit by fading in and out at certain areas to kind of make room for other instruments. Just listen how nice this sounds, so atmospheric. There's just so much movement here, and when you combine this with the other instruments that you have, it can really add a lot of beauty to the track. So we have some strings down here, and when I have movement on these strings, different chords, another one here, another one here, play this one as well. Some more down here. Right? The more layers of this you add, the more it can get complicated and sound bad, but if you're careful and place them appropriately, you can make it sound very beautiful. If you want to learn how to make drone pads like this, watch till the end, and I'll put it at the very end of the video in one of those things so you can click on it and watch it after. It's only a 2-minute long video. Up next, I have this cascading synth, and this is probably my favorite synth of the whole track. It's a Pigments preset called Rainforest, and it honestly just sounds so nice. There's so much movement, it's so dynamic, and this is what can really help a track like this feel very organic and humanized by using a synth like this. They're actually using a vibraphone sample with a lot of different modulation in the synth, and then an analog to give it a little bit of a synthesized feel as well, but just a really beautiful synth. And what I did is I cascaded it down the scale, going down and using dotted notes, which means it's 1 and then a half as well. So we actually have a 16th here, and then 2 more 16ths, and then the note plays, and then 2 more 16ths, and the note plays. And this gives it this kind of off the grid, whimsical kind of like floaty vibe. Check this out when it hits in the drop. Works really well for this. I like to duplicate presets a lot and manipulate them to fit in different parts, so I duplicated the cascading 2 more times. This one is a little bit like more muffled, and it plays more in the background, playing throughout the beginning of the track. And you'll notice that it's a little bit off time, and this is intentional so it feels more humanized. And lastly, I have this cascading one where I've increased the sustain so that they work as like pads. Just adds so much value to the melodic elements of this track. And my advice to you is when you're doing stuff like this, just play around with some different ideas, jam with your keyboard, put your scale on if you're unfamiliar with scales, and just jam along with some different presets and add a ton of delay and reverb to them to make these very atmospheric sounds. And then once you're happy with it, add another, and then add another, and see which ones you like the best. This is a lot of instruments happening all at once. It becomes difficult to mix, but if you blend it all together well, it can sound very beautiful. Last but not least, I have some stems from the original, so I have some effects. And I have here the lead. And again, what I've done is I've changed the pitch. So the second one is an octave lower. Sounds really warm and nice. And then here I have some more examples. Down by a fifth. It's really easy to take samples that are already bounced down to audio and then change the pitch of them to see if they would match well in the track. Sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes you can get really beautiful elements just by changing it 1 or 2 octaves or changing it a couple semitones. I'm not going to go over the effects. It's not that important, but the last thing that I want to talk about is really important, and that is relative keys. So I wrote this track in D minor. The track itself, D minor, but I also, for the breakdown, I decided to switch my thought process from writing in D minor to writing in the relative major, which is F major. It's the exact same notes, but my way of thinking changes when I look at the scale and I say, okay, I'm in D minor. Let me start at the root note of D and write my melody. What if I start with my thought process that I'm actually writing in F major? So I wrote my bass line in my breakdown like F major. And so that gave me a different outlook and perspective on how I can write the melodies. And I think it sounds very beautiful. And I'm really happy with the way that it sounds. And I'm just telling you this so that maybe you can think that when you're writing your tracks, don't just rely on writing in minor. Try writing in major as well, or vice versa. Try swapping them around, finding the relative keys and trying to play with those. And it'll give you a bit more experimentation and hopefully will give you some more creativity. I just love the way the bass line sounds, going from the D to the B flat in the F major. So the D and the D minor to the B flat in the F major. Check this out. So here, F major, D minor, same notes. So maybe it won't work for you, but it worked for me. It's just something that you can try out to try and increase your creativity by swapping to the relative major or minor. If you want to learn how to make lush pads like in this track, then click this video right here or check out this video right here, which Ableton thinks you'll like based on your algorithm.